Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining us on the latest of our hopefully thought-provoking webcasts. We're here to talk about the looming iceberg that affects credibility for internal controls over financial reporting. And fundamentally, this is about the need to know and manage who's who in the organization. So thanks for joining us. This is a 45-minute webcast, so we're going to try and make best use of your time. We're going to take questions as we go through. Today's discussion, my name is Dan French. I'm CEO at Consider Solutions, so I know many of you. Thank you for joining us again. I'm very pleased to be joined by Hans van Ness, our Chief Operating Officer. So welcome, Hans.
Thank you, Dan. Hello to all.
And so between us, we're going to share both some observations and feedback from some of the survey and work we've been doing with organizations around the world, both as clients and audit firms. So that's us. In terms of context, those of you who know us will know this story, but it's important to recognize how we view these problems. So as a business, Consider Solutions focuses on this aspiration of world-class finance, which is illustrated on the left. So the helping a business to achieve better business results, reducing the cost of finance, optimizing cash flow, and having better risk management are the characteristics of world-class finance. And on the right-hand side, this is how we help organizations deliver on that. So the pillars of financial control and compliance, broader risk management, and process optimization and transformation, all on a platform of technology and data, without which you can't do much these days. This focus on ICFR very much is around the left-hand pillar, financial control and compliance, but it does affect broader risk management and even processes, as you'll see as we go forward. So the ideas we're sharing today aren't all our own. We are very lucky to work with some global players, some great brands, so these are some of them. And a lot of the work we do comes from our work with them, and hopefully we get some additional insight also. So thank you for those of you on the call. But these are some of the folks we work with. So in terms of the structure of the 45-minute session, those are my introductions. I want to talk a little bit about the risk and the transition from risk to real threat. I'm going to talk a little bit about the iceberg around user access, which is something that I, for one, thought we might have cracked about 10 years ago, but it's evident we haven't, and indeed the situation is changing and in some respects getting worse. We're going to talk to you a little bit about implementing a process that works, or a process, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. And that will give you a hint to the fact that we're not talking a lot about technology. We're talking about how do you make processes operate in the organization that can make these goals sustainable. Talk about roadmaps to maturity and some considerations and conclusions of things you can take away with you to either consider or work on in your own organization. Then we'll have a Q&A session, so please do ask questions as we go through. You have a panel on your desktop, allows you to ask questions. There's some important topics here today, so please take every opportunity to ask questions. We'll endeavor to answer them at the end. If we don't have time in the 45 minutes to answer them all, we'll get back to you by email. So make best use of the time, and thank you for your attention. So quick bit of involvement from you. We're not going to allow you to fall into a gentle sleep by your computer. A couple of quick questions. This is really to add context to some of the information we're getting out of this. So just your role. So there's 5 options here. Are you a Chief Information Security Officer or someone in that function, IT risk, IT security, IT compliance? Are you number 2 in business risk, business security or business compliance role? 3, business or financial systems. 4, audit or independent assurance, or 5, interested observer. It should be straightforward. If you're not one of the top 4, you're an interested observer. So normally I give you 10 seconds, but I think 5 seconds is all you should need for that. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at what we got. So what's our audience today? Our audience is a small majority of business risk, security, compliance folks, 37%, closely followed by audit and independent assurance. Then the CISO and the team in that structure, interested observers, and business financial systems. Thanks for that. It just helps us get context on some of the feedback we get. And of course, all these polls are anonymous. So have no fear if we ask you anything delicate. So let's start by looking at managing risk and exposure to real threat, and this concept of material weakness. So very quickly, we hear about digital transformation all the time, but the real thing, digital transformation is two things. It's changes in business models, which isn't really digital. It's a business model transformation, and it's a technology transformation. So our businesses are changing, they're expanding, we're connecting to everybody from business process and business alignment point of view. We've got end-to-end business processes which are operating at speed and operating globally. All of our applications are broadening out beyond classical usage. We've got typical users, we've got technical users, we've got pieces of software, we've got RPA bots, we've got interfaces, and we've got Internet of Things. So lots of change in the dynamics of users of our systems. We're obviously exposing ourselves to vendors, customers, partners, and employees, and across all business processes. And of course, we've got open connectivity everywhere. That's just a little bit of context to help us understand why these things are changing so much. Now, obviously, anyone who's ever experienced an audit will know this is something you never want to see. You don't even want to see this slide, probably. But the idea of material weakness, when the risk is both highly probable and has a significant material impact on the accounts of the organization. So obviously, we want to avoid anything that looks like a material weakness, but frankly, we want to avoid anything that looks like anything that's turned up in a management letter. So the reason I raise this is the topic of today's webcast has really caused a lot of impact in this area. I'm going to share some examples. Obviously, how we protect ourselves from these risks, we all understand the 3 lines of defense, a classic IIA model, but it's important just to remind ourselves that in our risk management, the organization has sort of 3 ways of responding. The first line of defense is operational management in the field, which is executing the policies and executing the controls of the day as per the way the organization wants to operate. The second line of defense is those in financial controls, finance, IT security, risk management, and so on, who build the policies and they monitor the policies. And obviously monitor the controls as well, to make sure those controls are being executed. And the third line of defense is internal audit, which is the independent assurance. And as we think about this topic, as it becomes more complex, it's important for us to remember which line of defense we're talking about at any point in time, and also allow ourselves as organizations to make sure that our strategy does line up in all 3 lines. So user access, as I've said, we should have cracked this years ago, and perhaps we did to an extent, but things are changing. I've talked about some of those things. The impact is pretty painful, and we're seeing lots of press reports to that effect. Theft of information, brand damage, basically the reduction in value of corporations, business disruption, fraud, certainly a growing issue, and error and waste, and even just efficiency draining exceptions because of poorly managed user access. So these things are turning from a risk to a genuine threat. And I'm going to talk about some specific examples which you probably read about yourselves, but just worth bearing in mind. This is public knowledge. Columbia Sportswear recently had a senior IT director. He left the company to join a supplier as a chief technology officer. And before he left, he set up 2 spurious user accounts. So he kind of expected his own account to be closed down, but he used these new spurious accounts 700 times to monitor what his former employer was doing to benefit his new commercial position at the supplier. So, that's pretty obvious. It may be shocking and surprising, but, it makes you wonder who's watching the watchers, because as a senior IT director, probably part of the second line of defense. But here there's insufficient attention to immediately shutting down levers, and also who owns accounts. So these accounts, who is the manager of these supposedly spurious user accounts, and who's accountable for their behavior? Target stores, again, well publicized. Massive hack exposing data of 70 million customers, credit card details, all sorts of stuff. But contrary to popular belief, this wasn't through some black hat web hacking experience. It was the access was gained through a conventional supplier user account on a target store system, and ultimately resulted in a virus, affected all sorts of stuff. The key point is here that there was not enough attention to access control about user IDs are not just our employees. What's going on? Who's got access to our systems outside amongst our customers and our business partners? And this was a pretty classic account. It's not just highly privileged accounts we need to worry about. Here's an example. We can't mention the company name, but here was an example where a lot of repeat orders for spare parts for an engineer working with customers for industrial machinery. And basically, this particular service engineer was ordering lots of spare parts for machinery which was being reported as faulty but wasn't, and he was selling these expensive spare parts on eBay. Again, insufficient attention to access control for who's got what access to what, and insufficient focus on who is behind the user ID. Who's the individual that we're actually talking about, because we're managing individual behavior, not just user accounts. And this one, the last one, a technology firm, couple of $1 million stolen, financial controller, fair bit of autonomy, but they were clever enough to manage the segregation of duties issue, so they had a separate account for authorizing fraudulent accounts, so there's no segregation of duties issues here, very well controlled. But obviously the controller didn't have much oversight. He should have been under oversight of the CFO, and also this other account. Not enough focus on joiners, movers, and leavers. Who are these new accounts, or this person who had an ex-employee should have been deleted a long time ago. So insufficient focus on identity. These people behind the user IDs actually exist, and are they relevant people to support us today? Now, this particular example, just in the past 3 months, I know personally of 3 or 4 firms who've reported to me they've had exactly the same issue. The CFO or financial controller in the same situation, and the CEO and the board getting a nasty surprise. So there's more and more of this happening. So those are just some things to give us some pause for thought. But when we think about the actual threat, the cost of data breaches, okay, $7 million, maybe that's not material to many of the organizations on this call. But what I think is interesting about this research is when you listen to all of the stories on the media, again, we think it's kind of black hat folks getting access to us through firewalls and injecting malicious software. But actually, over 50% are caused internally. And of that is pretty much half and half. Careless employees who just don't realize the impact of their actions. And the other half is system and process glitches spanning IT and the business. So that's a massive impact. So insiders already passed the stage of perimeter threats and all that business. So it just reinforces the fact we need to get into that. And obviously there's the exposure to hacking and cyber attacks. And we all know about business email compromise, which is the accounts payable fraud, which we all know about. You get an email from the CFO, which may indeed actually come from the CFO, but he didn't write it. So it's all related. So it's important to keep tabs on this. So we've come a long way, but the risk is still growing. So these are the progress we've made. So in the past 10 to 15 years, we've made great access and management of user access for sensitive financial systems particularly. We've got joiners, movers, leavers policies for most organizations. Maybe they're not strong enough, maybe they're not complete enough. SOD policies exist. We've got super user access. We've got the ability to have user privilege provisioning automatically. We've got identity management technologies. And all of these point solutions, some of them which are very big, have a great deal to offer, but the access risk is growing. So it's worth just thinking, what are we missing? What are we not getting right for this to continue to happen? So one more question for you. So I've opened this discussion about identity user access risk. Who owns it in your organization? Not the name, but the role. Is it the Chief Information Security Officer, IT risk, etc.? Is number 2, is it business risk, security, or compliance? 3, an individual system or process owners. 4, a separate defined group, or 5, unknown or no identified owner. 10 seconds. So if you don't know, it's number 5. I think the other 4 are fairly clear. This system only allows 5 options, so you might be wondering I should have had 6 or 7, but no, there's only 5, because otherwise it wouldn't work. So give us your best shot at that. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look. So identity and access risk in your organization, that's quite interesting. So about a third of you, it's identity user access risk is owned by IT risk, the Chief Information Security Officer. Roughly a quarter by business risk, business security, business compliance. Another quarter about individual system or process owners. and 15%, 16% unknown or no identified owner. That's quite, it really is quite interesting. And I guess it goes to show a little bit about we're not clear necessarily on what the right answer is to that question, who should own it? So thanks for that. We'll talk more about this. So let's talk about the user access iceberg. So what's going on beneath the ocean? So we're seeing from our research with clients and audit firms, definitely where there are audit findings for an organization which have hit the executive agenda, those issues are generally getting better. So targeted access control, access governance is improving for those specific issues. A good example is segregation of duties in financial applications, for example. But the end-to-end access control and governance is becoming a growing weakness. And there's two evidences for this. One is the observation I made already about the changes in business models, the blending of workforces, connecting businesses, the explosion of systems and digitization and types of technology. But we're also seeing up to 20% of individual user accounts in large organizations are either unknown individuals, or they're just incorrect because people have left or departed or whatever, and should be immediately deactivated or removed. That's a massive threat. Up to 20%, 1 in 5 people, or 1 in 5 accounts, just shouldn't be there. But there's a growing concern from the audit community, and obviously the who's watching the watchers in this case is the PCAOB on behalf of the SEC and in the SOX world, basically are watching the audit firms. And they've identified growing experiences of multiple deficiencies in controls over user access. They've also done some specific targeted inspections, and in one case, the audit regulators have found for one auditor, 67% of the audits from just over a year and a half ago failed to comply with standards. So the PCAOB is realizing that just detecting and correcting audit deficiencies probably isn't good enough. So they're thinking about how they change and get more proactive. All this is affecting this very topic because we're starting to see a much greater interest and focus on the topic. So what we see below the surface, underlying this, perhaps it's no surprise, but there's 4 big issues. Process. So there are some capabilities in place, but a lack of a coherent, integrated end-to-end process is widespread. Very few organizations have it really cracked. So that, the process issue is up there first and foremost. People in organization, if there isn't a process, you can't have ownership of it. If there isn't a process, you can't have governance of it. So that creates a whole bunch of issues and part of the problem that we're seeing. Data, well, we talk about the importance of data and how much we've got. We've also got a lot more data about users and what they're doing and how they're operating and what systems they're accessing. So effective user access control requires accurate, timely data on organization, unit, and manager of people, of real individuals. And again, sometimes we're struggling with that. And data governance is a responsibility of management, but we've also got data protection issues which are growing. Regulations are growing, which limit our ability to use this information at will. And in technology, there's ever more technology. There's some big projects out there, which is great, but technology without a process, as we always know in every area of business, is a dangerous game. And whilst external cyber threat protection is important, we mustn't overlook the inside threat because that's really where we're seeing a lot of the impact. And again, who watches the watchers? So that's worth thinking about. So there's this eternal tug of war. We've got policies and controls in all our organizations, to a greater or lesser extent, they're implemented and defined. But we're in dynamic business operations. Our business operations are moving faster and they're changing faster than they ever have before. So the time pressure in dealing with these policies and controls, and that's where a lot of the breakdown happens. If it isn't an integrated process, we drop the ball. And that's made more complicated by the classic joiners, movers, leavers debate. In most organizations, this is regarded as a hire to retire process and typically owned by HR, which is fine. But when you think about this whole cycle from joining, from promotion and delegated authority and all that business, changing jobs, it's not just for the people we employ on the paper of the company, it's all of the subcontractors, the temporary staff, the folks in the BPO organization. Who deals with all these? And usually we find that the HR organization doesn't have visibility of that. So maybe our hire to retire process isn't really complete when we recognize that we need to know about our joiners, movers, leavers. So worthy of thought. So a third question for you. Talked about joiners, movers, leavers, hire to retire. In the context of what I've just said, it's not just about our own people, it's about all the people that operate and act on our processes on our behalf. How would you rate the joiners, movers, leavers process in your organization? Is it 1, strong and consistent, integrated process and technology? Is it 2, a fair process implementation, but there's some gaps? 3, a weak implementation, but there's a process defined, just isn't well rolled out? 4 is not really yet defined, but we know who owns it. And 5, not defined or owned. Have a think about that. It's important. So you've got 10 seconds to think about it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look. So nearly half of you got a fair process with gaps. Great. Well, congratulations. A weak implementation, but there's some process. Nearly a quarter of you. Then followed by strong and consistent. Nearly 1 in 5 have a strong, consistent, integrated process and technology. That is excellent. And then a few people down in the not yet defined or not defined or owned. Okay. Thank you for that. So why is doing this so hard? Doing it properly. If we know what the issues are, why is doing it so hard? Well, these are the 3 big ones. Gaining executive attention for the issue, I've noticed, is a big issue for lots of reasons. And I think a lot of it is to do with lack of clarity and precision on what the problem is and what the resolution path is to solve it and the process to be implemented. I think lots of people throw in technology plans and business cases for technology, and I think executives are a little bit wary of technology alone. I think there is another part of the problem. There's an assumption that it is an IT general controls issue. So just can't the IT department just sort that out, part of normal operations? Now, as I'm going to share with you, and I think it's fairly obvious from the point about joiners, movers, leavers, it's evident it's not an IT general controls issue. At the very least, it's an application controls issue, and you can debate further. And then the scale of the problem, the systems landscape, is it too big? If you haven't got a clear view on the issue and a resolution path, if it's a big problem, it's kind of too hard to put in the too hard pile. Second bit is developing a workable plan. So if you haven't got clarity on the issue, it's difficult to put a workable plan together. And I see this as wrestling with a jellyfish. So you've got joiners, movers, leavers, you've got finance, you've got controls, IT process impacts. Nobody knows where to start. And again, clarity of business purpose relates to the first point as well. Then thirdly, execution. Process design, implementation, and operation. It's not a project. Without doubt, anything that's sustainable, has continuous contribution, is a process, not a project. You've got the issue about data ownership. Who owns the data related to this? Who owns the process? And then how do we go about having rapid iterative delivery of useful capabilities along a roadmap to better user access governance? So those are 3 big unpleasant issues. Now, this is kind of reinforced by this interesting survey from IDG. So they did a survey about what are the biggest challenges to ensuring applications are protected from unwarranted use. And I think this really shows the dichotomy between the lack of funding and resources or direction and having a plan. Because number one, 44% who don't have enough money, okay? But then lack of specialized knowledge, lack of skilled resources, lack of overall strategy of the next 3. Policy generation and management. These play to the argument that we don't quite understand the problem well enough yet, and we can't actually build a plan because we don't have the skilled resources to do it. But my argument is if you can't build a plan, then you don't know how much it's going to cost. So I think sometimes we use funding as an issue which is kind of an easy place to park the too hard problem. But maybe, definitely not a maybe, if we have a better understanding of the what needs to be done and having a workable plan, we'll find that funding, first of all, is not quite as heinous as we thought, and secondly, it might be easier to access. Well, it's good news in terms of addressing the issue, and it's probably bad news in terms of getting a bit close to home. So external audit are now paying increased attention, without a doubt. So if your external auditors aren't yet, get ready, because they're about to. The public news stories do focus attention. Cyber threats and business email compromise, accounts payable fraud, it's becoming a C-suite issue, it's all related. Now, the Chief Information Security Officer is often becoming the point person here, which is good to have a point person, but the challenge is that CISO is typically an IT role, and this is a cross-organizational problem, it's not an IT problem. So for this to work, the CISO needs to be a change agent for the wider organization, which is great for the forward-thinking, advanced CISOs we have in the world, but it's a challenge for organizations who perhaps don't have the right skills in that role. If you've got too technical a CISO and not a change agent, you're going to have a challenge. So there's some good stuff going on, and it's worth us, at least relying on that, benefiting from that. And here's a quote from one of the big four firms, which I think is important to share. Why is attestation of user access such a big deal? Well, we're linked to the fact that PCAOB, audit firm inspections were very hot. So now audit firms have been taking a firm line, which means that you might not have had audit issues before, but you're going to get them now. So very important point. So let's talk about implementing a process that works without the 7-year wait and all the unpleasantness. So the big insight, I think, that comes from the research is that this isn't a single process issue. That's one of the reasons why organizations are struggling with these big multi-year projects that never quite connect. There's the joiners, movers, leavers management issue, which we've kind of touched on, but that's a business hire to retire problem. And there's a link here to how people get access to systems and how we revoke access to systems. Risk, policy, and controls management. We've got a definition, implementation, operation, monitoring, and remediation process, often under finance, often under an internal controls organization. And that includes controls over user access. And then we've got the physical, or I say physical, the access management itself of our systems, about how do we manage the permissions, the individuals, the user IDs, the directories, the manager of, what's the security models, all of the mechanics of how we manage access into the multiplicity of systems we have. Each of these processes intersects with the others, and if any one of those isn't well defined, we're going to have a problem, which does make it not just a big insight, but it seems to make it a bigger problem at first sight. But it's really important just recognizing that is a big issue. So we know this covers first and second line of defense. There's many different stakeholders. There's a lot of stuff going on. So what comes out of the work and the research we've been doing is a reality hack, how to make progress fast. We come back to this idea of the user access review, and there's nothing new in user access reviews. We've had them, the principles and even the practice to an extent has been there for many, many years. But it's not a new concept, but it now has new value because we understand the relationship to these three big processes. And the idea of a user access review, for those of you who perhaps aren't close to it, is to ensure there's a systematic way on a regular basis to ensure that all managers in the organization can confirm that people under their responsibility, individuals under their responsibility, either employed or subcontracted or through the BPO or whatever, should have access to the things they have access to. So they have to attest and confirm that. So it means you need to know who the individuals behind the user IDs, and the managers need to confirm it. Sounds simple, but that has a massive impact because it allows us to confirm the first line control execution, because first line management meant to be doing those things. But it also very quickly identifies the weaknesses and the biggest risks. It ensures immediate visibility and immediate compliance, albeit for the short term, because it's not really sustainable until you crack the three processes, but it builds a case for action on the key observations and priorities. So we're certainly seeing a really, really powerful place for the user access review, the humble user access review, which perhaps is less humble than we once thought it was. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, about why it's so important. User access reviews, I'm sure most of you do these at some level. So just tell us, do you operate them monthly, quarterly, annually, ad hoc, i.e. when asked, or never? Pretty straightforward. 10 seconds again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look. So quarterly, so about nearly 40% of you operate in quarterly. Good, because that, in our opinion, that's best practice, so that's great. 11% monthly, that's great. 18% annually, 21% ad hoc, and 11% never. Okay, well, I'd suggest if you're ad hoc and never, you probably want to get ready for a bit of external audit attention. So thank you for that. I'm now going to pass over to Hans to talk to us a little bit about the pragmatic approach to user access reviews and how we deal with these processes, because they seem complex and perhaps there's a smart way through this. Hans.
Thanks, Dan. Based upon our activities over the years and the research and looking at things that work and don't work or should work better, we have defined a pragmatic 5-step approach with the proven best practice to address a user access review. It is relatively straightforward. Maybe it resembles what you're doing today, maybe it is new to you, and I will do a quick walkthrough of the 5 stages. First of all, you need to know what and who to address. So the scope, which users, only the employees, or maybe also the temp staff, what sources or what systems that you will be looking at, maybe only your ERP or also including your feeder systems, including your IDMs and what have you. Which stakeholders that are involved in this whole process, and some rules of arbitrage if needed, if some of the sources give conflicting definitions or data. The second step is, of course, is getting the data, and sometimes it is enough to get the raw data, especially if you want system and you can start using that. But if you have multiple systems, it might be needed to map your raw data to some common model if needed, to make sure that you have standard definitions and that you deal with the different authorization structures in your technology. And when you have that data, of course, analyze it for the obvious exceptions on orphans, duplicates, group IDs, and what have you. Once you have analyzed the data, you should prepare it per reviewer, or as we like to call it, per unit of management. You have to explain why you go through this process. Maybe it's the first time that a manager sees this, what the aim is, what value should come out of it, and what is the effect downstream of the actions that this manager, this reviewer, will order. And not only say, well, here's the list and sort it out yourself, but suggest the likely decisions that they could take, like remove certain users or change roles or apply compensating controls. And of course, then the reviewer has to decide upon those suggested advices and sign them off. And the user access review team must make sure that they are processed accordingly, either by themselves or delegated to other existing elements in the organization, for instance, for the technical deprovisioning, if that is required. The process can be automated, and that doesn't have to be a big exercise. A lot of it can be done relatively quickly, sometimes reusing existing technical components that you also already have around in your organization. But of course, you need at least a workflow tool to coordinate this all. You can do this automation straight away from the first time that you run a user access review, but also you can build it up over time. And you will gain maturity over time. It is good to start with a relatively limited scope to run it, to do it, to learn, to improve it, and to make the organization more and more aware that this is a sensible thing, not an admin burden, but it gives value to whole the organization. And over time, you can widen your scope. For instance, also include external resources or the resources from a shared service organization that you're using. Add more systems, also maybe the legacy systems that are out there that are often not so well controlled, bring them into the scope. And last but not least, you can widen the depth of your analysis. In this example mentioned here is, for instance, you could look at the last logon of a certain user ID that to make you determine if the access granted is really needed. To guide your journey to maturity, you need a roadmap. If you don't plan to do learn and improve, it will make it difficult to make sure that you progress to a next level, and also to make sure that you relate to the 3 processes that Dan has presented that are involved in this area. And to do that, we ourselves are using a framework for governance that makes sure that you address the topic as a process, not as a project, with 9 segments that address all elements relevant to getting the process governance implemented and improved over time. IT is just one of those aspects, and I will come back on the other aspects a bit later. If you think back on the three processes that Dan has presented, risk, policy and controls, joiners, movers, leavers, and system access, they all probably have a framework of their own, or whatever you call it, a program or a roadmap, probably with their own pace, with their own maturity. Some organizations have all three of them running in some sort. Some organizations have focused, for instance, only on the more technical system access. They have common elements, and it would be a shame not to use a user access review to combine those elements. So the user access review itself you could look upon as a framework with the 9 segments involved, and they will give not only the guidance of the continuous improvement on the user access review itself, but it gives also fuel to the other 3 processes. I give you now an example of the 9 segments of the framework for a user access review, so you can see what elements that are touched. The first 4 elements are making sure that the drivers while you're doing this are clear and set for everybody, and the expected value from by all the stakeholders is defined. The ownership will be defined, and also that you send benchmarks. Where do you start and where do you want to end up with? Do you want to go for a 0 deficiency, or are you going for other kind of measures? And of course, the organization is important, that you include all the stakeholders there, both from the business side, the financial side, and of course the IT side where appropriate. The other 5 elements talk about how your process is designed, how it will be executed, who is running them, what is the relation to your IT, which tools are you using for it. And in this example, the organization has chosen to have the UAR run as a service, not doing it themselves, but in the first few iterations to get an external resource to run them for them, because strange eyes might help the pace going up, and also it's a learning exercise, and by having a third party, it forces you to rethink feedback loops implemented to make sure that what you create is what your stakeholders need. And in summary, if you want to start this, just start mapping your current landscape first. This is an example template that we use where we note down the who, what, how, the oversight and the risk involved with the access management implementation in your organization. And you can have multiple per system, because they can be different per system or even organizational unit. By doing that, you will identify some wide gaps, unknown elements. That's not a bad thing, as long as you have enough filled-in elements to create a good user access review in the first iteration, and then fill in your gaps and address them over time.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. That's a really a good, insightful talk through some of the practicalities of managing these processes, the user access review, and some of the templates you can use to make life a bit easier. So we're just going to come now with some considerations and conclusions. I do ask you, ask any questions you can right now. Opportunity to do so. Take every chance. We're running up to our the end of the session. So, in summary, why user access reviews have become more important than perhaps they were before. The UAR does provide evidence of authorization of system access, and thus an element of authorization over financially relevant transactions activities. It helps us through a second line of defense process. It helps us assess the first line of defense as well, so you get 2 hits for 1, if you like. And what is really interesting is UAR, the user access review, exposes and addresses the joiners, movers, leavers issues. It exposes and addresses the internal controls, risk and internal controls issues, and the technical access management issues. So it's a really interesting way of highlighting the elements in those 3 processes that aren't working well. It's a very It's a very helpful complement to such access controls or segregation duties. It's a different thing because, of course, you can have perfect segregation of duties with no conflicts, but that doesn't tell you haven't got user IDs which are sitting there without real or authorized people using them. So worth thinking about that. I would also add that, you know, perhaps one of the reasons why organizations have thrown large sums of money at the technology angle to this is this hope there's a silver bullet. But we always hope for an easy fix, but the reality is that we all know that there isn't one for anything. There are no easy fixes. There's lots of tasks that need lots of small steps to go right. And I like this. This is a comment from the surgeon's note on performance, and perhaps that surgeon should have been working in enterprise business processes, because we've had exactly the same experience. So you can call this an aggregation of marginal gains. So I like the way Hans has broken this down into simple tasks. So these are things we actually have to execute to make this all work. So there's some things you can do to take away from this. I would recommend you think about these three processes and what the health check, or just some kind of assessment against your joiners, movers, leavers, your risk policy and controls management, and your technical access management process. It's just worth thinking about, looking at. If you want some advice, we can help you. But it's, you know, just having a consensus on how those things work and where they interrelate is very, very important. The policy and control map per application. Hans just showed you a template. You can happy for you to have that. Document the control points, map by application, have the end-to-end view. And thirdly, do undertake user access reviews, because if you're getting away with it at the moment, you might not be getting away with it in the future. Implement a simple automated process. Consider doing this as a service or as an assessment as a quick start. Isolate and highlight the process issues and priority risks. You don't have to go into a whole, you know, let's decide on technology and let's build big processes. Let's get into identifying the issues. So that's what I'd recommend, 3 things for you to think about. So we have, we've covered these topics. Thank you for your attention. We've got a few questions, so keep them coming in. If you haven't asked the questions now, probably you want to send them by email to Emma, who's also on this, and she'll make sure you get the right person. But I've got, we have exactly 3 minutes. So, first question, how do RPA bots affect the issue of user access? Now, this is an interesting one. We touched on this a little bit. So I did mention technical or non-person users, sometimes known as inhuman users, which probably get the right smile. But these can be interfaces, RPA bots, IoT nodes, or whatever, where a user ID is needed to interact with other systems, particularly with ERP systems, for example. And the fact that these are growing at a great rate is part of the spike in the risk and threat that we've talked about. And as I mentioned earlier on, what you need to do is clearly identify the real identity behind every user ID. Now, normally we think about who's the human individual behind a user ID, but if it's a bot, you need to be very clear what the bot is, who owns it, what it's meant to be doing, and you need to be clear that user activities are being performed by the bot rules themselves, because there are cases already where individuals have hijacked bot user IDs to perform activities themselves. So from simple review, it looks like the RPA bot is doing its thing, but actually somebody using a user ID. Now, sometimes that's for good reason, people trying to help out, but sometimes it's malicious. So be aware and be sure you know. So that's a very good question. Thank you for that. Next question is interesting. Can I use my GRC or integrated risk management tool for user access reviews? Well, okay. Well, Hans, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's fine. Well, if your tool or tool suite has attestation workflow capabilities, that's one prerequisite, and very important, connects to your system landscape in an let's call it access-aware way, meaning that it can really get to the factual data needed for the user access review, then the answer is yes. If it doesn't have both those elements, the access awareness and the workflow capabilities, probably it's unlikely that you can use it for that.
Okay, thanks, Hans. That is, so there's a number of other questions, but thank you for those. We have hit our 45 minutes on the dot. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it thought-provoking. We certainly have found it thought-provoking going through the research process, and I've learned things I didn't expect to learn. Thank you very much indeed, and speak to you soon. Thank you.